Saudi Arabia just paid for oil in Chinese yuan. Not a small transaction, not a test. 41% of all its oil settlements in March 2026 in yuan. And two of its state-owned banks formally joined China's alternative to SWIFT in the same month. If you think that's just a Middle East story, keep watching, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that decision is already showing up in your mortgage rate. If this kind of analysis connects global money shifts to your actual financial life, hit subscribe right now. We break this down daily, not weekly. And what's happening right now is moving too fast to miss. Here are the numbers from March 2026 that every serious investor needs to see. China's CIPS payment system, the direct alternative to SWIFT, processed $214 billion in a single month. On its single busiest day, it processed the equivalent of $178.5 billion across 42,000 transactions. Both figures are all-time records. The average daily transaction value in March climbed to the equivalent of $920 billion, a 50% surge from February alone, in a single month. China-Russia bilateral trade hit $245 billion in 2024, exactly double the 2020 level, and over 90% of it settled in yuan and rubles. Russia has completely removed the dollar and the euro from its $600 billion in international reserves, replacing them with gold and yuan. And Standard Chartered's chief economist for Greater China called what he was watching in the energy markets the beginnings of a Petroyuan. Now, here is what most financial channels won't tell you. And this is the part you need to stay for. Because the dollar's position is more nuanced, more resilient, and yet more genuinely threatened than either the panic merchants or the dismissers want you to believe. Drop a comment right now. Tell me which city you're watching from and whether you think March 2026 was an inflection point or just noise. Those comments tell me what to investigate next, and I read every one of them. CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, launched in 2015. For its first several years, it was niche infrastructure, primarily used to support China's Belt and Road investments and modest yuan trade flows. By the end of 2025, CIPS had connected over 1,700 financial institutions across 189 countries and processed transactions cumulatively exceeding $94 trillion. Annual processing grew at 43% year-on-year for multiple consecutive years. But here's the detail that separates honest analysis from outrage content. CIPS currently relies on SWIFT's messaging service for over 80% of its transactions. The two systems are more complementary than adversarial, for now. SWIFT still connects 11,500 institutions across 235 countries. The yuan holds only 3% of global SWIFT payment currency share, versus 48% for the dollar. The dollar's dominance is real, structural, and deeply embedded in decades of infrastructure, legal frameworks, and institutional habit that cannot be replaced quickly. That honest foundation matters, because what changed in February 2026 makes the March surge structurally significant rather than just a volume spike. And once you understand what changed, you won't look at these numbers the same way again. China enacted the first major update to CIPS business rules in 8 years, specifically widening its scope beyond yuan-only transactions and opening the door to handling multiple currencies and other payment channels. CIPS is no longer just a yuan settlement rail. It is actively repositioning as a global payments platform that can handle multiple currencies, compete with SWIFT on broader ground, and provide dollar-free settlement for any transaction its participants choose to route through it. Son of Renmin University's Shenzhen Advanced Institute of Finance confirmed the direction publicly. CIPS transactions are expected to expand from traditional trade settlement into financial market settlement, liquidity management, and integrated cash management through 2026. The infrastructure is being upgraded from a bypass lane into a parallel highway. And here is the mechanism that makes this story about American power, not just global finance trivia. The dollar's financial dominance does not rest primarily on its role as a store of value. It rests on its role as the mandatory intermediary currency for global commerce. The fact that virtually all international payments pass through correspondent banks with U.S. connections, giving Washington the ability to monitor, restrict, or terminate any financial relationship anywhere on Earth through OFAC sanctions. This extraterritorial reach, the ability to cut any country off from global commerce with a Treasury Department filing, is the most powerful peacetime financial weapon ever constructed. It works because the dollar sits in the middle of nearly every transaction. When the dollar is no longer in the middle, the weapon loses its reach. Every yuan transaction that routes through CIPS rather than SWIFT is a transaction the U.S. Treasury cannot directly monitor, restrict, or sanction. That is not a theoretical observation. It is the explicit design purpose of the system, stated clearly by the institutions that built it. One institutional analysis put it directly. CIPS does not challenge the dollar's status as the reserve currency, but it does undermine a key pillar of dollar dominance, the power of financial sanctions. That distinction is critical. De-dollarization is not one phenomenon. It is two separate processes running in parallel at very different speeds. The first track is slow. Reserve currency status, measured in IMF data, declining at 1 to 2 percentage points per year, from 72% in 2001 to 56.9% in 2025. This is real but gradual. The dollar's deep capital markets, rule of law credibility, and institutional embedding make this a decades-long story. The second track is fast. Sanctions enforcement infrastructure, measured in CIPS volumes, alternative payment network growth, and the specific architecture of bypass tools built since 2022. This is moving at 50% per month when geopolitical events accelerate demand. And the critical mechanism is this. The dollar's sanctions enforcement power does not depend on whether the yuan is 3% or 30% of global reserves. It depends on whether international transactions must route through U.S. correspondent banks. Every transaction that routes through CIPS instead never touches a U.S. bank. The weapon's reach shrinks with every dollar of additional CIPS volume, entirely independent of any reserve currency movement at all. March 2026 was a fast-track event. The conflict in Iran, the IRGC demanding yuan or crypto payments for Strait of Hormuz transits, Russian oil payments, Saudi banking integration with CIPS, all converging simultaneously. The result was record single-day volumes, record monthly volumes, and a formal CIPS rule change widening its mandate to global multi-currency settlement, all in the same month. Russia has completely removed the dollar from its reserves. Sanctioned entities globally used $154 billion in crypto in 2025, a near 700% increase in a single year, adding a second bypass lane alongside the yuan one. The chief economist at Daiichi Life Research Institute said publicly, "The movement away from the dollar will continue to accelerate as these alternative networks reach critical mass." The weapon is not broken, but the armor it was designed to penetrate just got measurably thicker in March 2026. Now here is the balanced reality that every serious investor needs to hold in their head at the same time. The dollar still handles 88% of all global foreign exchange transactions. The dollar still represents 51% of SWIFT payment currency share versus yuan's 3%. A survey of global central bankers published by the Carnegie Endowment confirmed that through 2026, net demand by global central banks for dollar assets will likely remain more pervasive than demand for euro, renminbi, yen, and pound assets combined. Most CIPS direct participants are entities within financial groups highly interconnected with the dollar system, and thus vulnerable to U.S. secondary sanctions if they openly defy Washington. The yuan is not freely convertible. China openly manages its exchange rate. These are real structural constraints that limit how quickly the yuan can replace the dollar as a genuine global reserve currency. Voluntary de-dollarization typically follows 15 to 20-year timelines. The British pound's decline from 65% of global reserves in 1913 to negligible levels took 40 to 50 years. No one is replacing the dollar next Tuesday. That honest foundation acknowledged. Here is why the sanctions weapon degradation is still the most strategically consequential development in global finance right now, and why it directly costs every American money, regardless of whether full de-dollarization happens in 5 years or 50. The dollar's reserve currency privilege saves the U.S. government an estimated $100 billion annually in lower Treasury borrowing costs, the structural demand from global reserve accumulation that suppresses yields. As that demand weakens, as BRICS nations, Middle Eastern sovereign funds, and emerging market central banks diversify marginally away from dollars each quarter, U.S. Treasury yields stay structurally elevated. The 10-year Treasury yield currently sits at 4.41%, despite multiple Fed rate cuts. The IMF's 2026 fiscal monitor confirmed the safety premium on U.S. Treasuries is measurably narrowing. That premium narrowing is already embedded in your 6.3% to 6.83% 30-year mortgage rate. The sanctions weapon degradation adds a second channel. When U.S. sanctions are less credible, when CIPS roots around enforcement, when crypto provides a $154 billion parallel economy for sanctioned entities, when China's blocking order protects $100 billion in Iranian oil trade, Washington's leverage in global negotiations weakens. The Iran conflict energy shock that pushed energy prices up 21.2% in a single month is partly a product of a sanctions architecture that can no longer enforce a complete economic blockade of its target. The paradox stated precisely. Every time Washington uses dollar sanctions to achieve a short-term geopolitical goal, it accelerates the long-term construction of infrastructure designed to make dollar sanctions power irrelevant. It doesn't collapse the dollar. It just shrinks the perimeter within which the weapon works. And a weapon whose effective range is contracting every quarter is a weapon whose strategic value is declining, even if it remains the most powerful financial instrument on Earth for the foreseeable future. BRICS nations now settle 67% of intra-block trade in local currencies, up from under 20% a decade ago. The BRICS Bridge Wholesale CBDC settlement platform and BRICS Clear proposed securities clearing system are both under active development, creating the full stack of alternative financial infrastructure from payment rails to securities settlement. The OFAC designation list expanded from 120 entities in 2001 to over 900 by 2024, meaning the sanctions weapon was deployed at a scale and frequency that guaranteed it would eventually face organized, systematic resistance. The data says the dollar is durable, but no longer uncontested. The reserve currency story is slow. The sanctions bypass story is fast. And March 2026 was the month both stories accelerated at the same time. If this gave you a clearer picture of where the dollar is actually headed, not the panic version, not the dismissal version, the honest version, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me which city you're watching from. Every comment tells me this analysis is reaching people who actually care about getting this right. And if you want this level of breakdown delivered daily, directly tracking how global payment shifts affect your savings, your borrowing costs, and your purchasing power, subscribe. No hype, just the numbers, the mechanisms, and the honest picture.